The most humiliating moment of Sophie Miller's life happened in the place she once called home. She stood beside the dining table, holding a folded napkin in her hands, while another woman calmly took the seat that had belonged to Sophie for 6 years. Nobody stopped her. Not Sophie's husband, not his family, not even the guests who knew exactly what was happening. But one elderly woman was watching everything. And when she finally stood up, her voice was so powerful that the entire mansion went silent. "Get out of that chair." But before that shocking moment happened, Sophie had spent 6 years believing she had a happy marriage. When she married Ryan Miller, neither of them had much money. They lived in a tiny apartment, shared an old car, and counted every dollar carefully. Their first anniversary was simple. Sophie cooked dinner at home, and Ryan bought a small cake from a local bakery. They were not rich, but Sophie believed they were building something together. When Ryan decided to start his own company, Sophie became his biggest supporter. While he worked on business plans, she organized his paperwork. When investors rejected him, she encouraged him. When he stayed awake late at night trying to find a solution, Sophie stayed beside him. She never asked for anything in return. Then, slowly, Ryan's business began to grow. The tiny apartment was replaced by a beautiful mansion. The old car was replaced by expensive vehicles. Ryan's name began appearing in business magazines. His bank account grew quickly. But there was another change Sophie noticed. Ryan was no longer the same man. He started coming home late. His phone was always in his hand. He suddenly had private meetings that he never explained. And whenever Sophie asked how his day had gone, he seemed annoyed. At first, she told herself it was just stress. Then one evening, she found something she could no longer ignore. There were messages between Ryan and another woman. Her name was Chloe. She was younger, confident, and already appearing beside Ryan at company events. Sophie stared at the photographs on his phone, trying to understand how the man she had helped build a life with could betray her so easily. She did not scream. She did not throw anything. She simply looked at Ryan and asked one question. "Do I still matter to you?" Ryan said nothing. And somehow that silence hurt more than any confession could have. But Sophie did not leave that night. There was one person in that mansion she could not abandon. Ryan's grandmother, Evelyn. The elderly woman had always treated Sophie like her own granddaughter. And while everyone else celebrated Ryan's success, Evelyn remembered something important. She remembered who had stood beside him when he had nothing. She remembered Sophie. And Sophie was about to discover that Evelyn remembered far more than anyone realized. The chair was still warm when Vanessa sat down. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Elena stood beside the table, trying to control the shaking in her hands. She had spent the entire afternoon preparing that dinner. She had arranged the flowers, checked the plates, and made sure Margaret's favorite food was ready. She had done everything as if this were still her family. But now Vanessa was sitting in Elena's place. And Daniel said nothing. That silence hurt more than the betrayal itself. Elena looked at him, waiting for even a small sign that he understood what was happening. Nothing. Daniel simply looked down at his glass. So Elena quietly turned away. She decided she would leave the dining room before she completely broke down in front of the guests. Then, scrape. Margaret's chair suddenly moved across the floor. Everyone turned. The elderly woman slowly stood up. She was still recovering from her illness, and normally she needed help walking. But at that moment, she stood without assistance. Her eyes were fixed on Vanessa. "Get up!" The words were quiet, but they carried across the entire room. Vanessa froze. "I'm sorry?" she asked. Margaret pointed directly at the chair. "I said, get up!" Vanessa looked toward Daniel, expecting him to defend her. He didn't. Margaret took another step forward. "That chair belonged to Alina long before you entered this house." Vanessa's face turned red. "It's only a chair." Margaret's expression hardened. No, you are wrong. She looked around the table. That chair represents the woman who stayed when this family had nothing. Elena's eyes filled with tears. Margaret continued. When Daniel had a dream but no money, who supported him? Nobody answered. When his first business deal failed, who stayed awake beside him? Still nobody spoke. Margaret looked directly at Daniel. Your wife. Daniel slowly raised his eyes. Margaret's voice became stronger. Where was Vanessa when Elena worked late nights helping you build your company? Daniel looked uncomfortable. Where was she when Elena sold her own jewelry to help you pay your early business expenses? The room became completely silent. Vanessa suddenly looked toward Daniel. You never told me that. Margaret gave a bitter smile. Of course he didn't. Elena lowered her head. She had never wanted anyone to know about those sacrifices. She had done them because she loved Daniel. But now, sitting across from the woman who had replaced her, she finally understood something painful. Daniel had remembered the luxury. He had remembered the mansion. He had remembered the money. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the woman who helped him get there. Then Margaret looked at him and asked the question that finally broke his silence. Daniel, when did you become ashamed of the woman who believed in you before anyone else did? Daniel's face changed. For the first time that evening, he had no excuse. And Elena realized the answer could change her entire future. Daniel finally stood up. He looked at Elena, then at Margaret, and finally at Vanessa. For the first time that evening, he seemed to understand how terrible his silence had been. Elena, he said quietly. She looked at him. I know I have hurt you. Elena almost laughed. Hurt me? Her voice was calm, but her eyes were full of pain. You didn't just hurt me, Daniel. You made me feel like everything we built together was worthless. Daniel stepped closer. That isn't true. Then why did you let another woman sit in my place? He had no answer. Elena continued. When you had nothing, I stood beside you. When people laughed at your business idea, I told you to keep going. When you were afraid you would fail, I reminded you why you started. She paused. And when you finally became successful, you started acting like I was the thing holding you back. Daniel lowered his head. I was selfish. Margaret watched him carefully. Daniel looked at Elena again. I thought money had changed my life. I thought having more attention, more success, and more choices meant I was finally happy. His voice became weaker. But I was wrong. Vanessa suddenly stood. This is ridiculous, she said. You are making me the villain when your marriage was already falling apart. Elena turned toward her. You're right about one thing. Vanessa looked surprised. Our marriage was already broken. Elena took a breath. But you didn't break it alone. Daniel looked at her. I did that myself. The room became silent again. Vanessa grabbed her purse and walked toward the door. Nobody tried to stop her. Before leaving, she looked back at Daniel. You'll regret this. Daniel didn't answer. The door closed behind her. Elena expected to feel victorious. She didn't. Instead, she felt empty. 6 years of memories could not disappear because another woman had finally walked out of the room. Daniel slowly approached her. I want to fix this. Elena looked into his eyes. You cannot fix 6 years in one night. I know. You cannot apologize today and expect me to forget tomorrow. I know. And you cannot ask me to come back just because you finally realized what you lost. Daniel nodded. I understand. Elena's voice softened. Good. She looked toward Margaret. The elderly woman gave her a small, encouraging smile. Then Elena made a decision Daniel never expected. I am leaving this house. Daniel's eyes widened. Elena? No, she shook her head. I am not leaving because you told me to, and I am not leaving because she took my chair. She picked up her bag. I am leaving because I finally understand that I deserve a life where I don't have to beg someone to respect me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Daniel stood frozen. For years, he had believed Elena would always be there. Tonight, he finally realized something terrifying. She might not be. The next morning, Elena packed a small suitcase. She walked through the mansion one last time. Every room carried a memory. Their first celebration, their first business success, their late-night conversations, and all the moments she had mistaken sacrifice for love. At the front door, she stopped. Daniel was standing behind her. He didn't try to block her. He simply said, "I hope one day you can forgive me." Elena looked back. "Maybe I will." Then she walked away. And for the first time in 6 years, she chose herself. 3 months passed. Elena's life was no longer the same. She had moved into a small apartment across town. It was not luxurious, but it was peaceful. There were no arguments, no uncomfortable dinners, and no constant feeling that she had to compete for her own husband's attention. She found a new job at a small design company. The salary was modest, but her manager respected her. For the first time in years, Elena came home from work feeling proud instead of exhausted. Daniel, meanwhile, had changed too. At first, Elena did not believe it. She had heard apologies before. But Daniel did not simply apologize. He started making real changes. He stopped seeing Vanessa completely. He began spending time with Margaret, helping her with appointments and daily needs. He also started looking through the old business records from the early years of his company. And there, buried inside a box, he found something that stopped him cold. A handwritten note from Elena. It was dated 6 years earlier. Daniel read it slowly. It was a short message she had written when his company was close to failing. She had written, "Don't give up. One day, people will believe in you. Until then, I will." Daniel stared at those words for a long time. Then he cried. Not because he had lost money, not because his business was in danger, but because he finally understood what he had thrown away. A few weeks later, Margaret invited Elena to dinner. Elena almost refused. She wasn't ready to return to the mansion, but Margaret promised it would be different. So Elena agreed. When she arrived, the house looked exactly the same, but something had changed. Daniel was waiting near the entrance. He didn't try to hug her. He didn't ask her to come back. He simply said, "Thank you for coming." Elena nodded. They walked into the dining room, and Elena stopped. The same chair was there. The chair Vanessa had taken months earlier. But this time, nobody was sitting in it. Margaret smiled. "Elena, sit down." Elena looked at the chair. Then she looked at Daniel. "I don't think that chair belongs to me anymore." Margaret shook her head. "No, sweetheart, it was never about the chair." She pointed gently toward Elena. "It was about whether you understood your worth." Elena's eyes filled with tears. Daniel stepped forward. "I know I cannot undo what I did." He took a breath. "But if you ever decide to give me another chance, I want to earn it. Not with money. Not with promises." He looked directly into her eyes. "With my actions." Elena remained silent. She didn't forgive him that night. But she didn't walk away either. And sometimes, healing doesn't begin with a perfect apology. Sometimes it begins when someone finally stops asking you to forget and starts proving they have changed. Months later, Elena and Daniel began rebuilding their relationship slowly. There was no magical ending, no instant forgiveness. Just two people learning that love is not about who has more money, more power, or more choices. It is about respect. It is about loyalty. And most importantly, it is about remembering who stood beside you when you had nothing. Elena never forgot what happened, but she also never allowed it to define her. Because the greatest lesson she learned was simple. Never let someone else's failure to value you make you question your own worth. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Unexpected Life Stories for more emotional stories with powerful life lessons. And remember, sometimes losing someone who doesn't value you is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of finding yourself again.